And Amit is going to be talking about monetary tightening, bank fragility, and implications. I am Sumit AGARWAL. I'm a professor at NUS. Let me try to give an introduction to Amit. If you don't know him, you shouldn't be here, but let me still give a formal introduction to Amit or who he is, okay? Or you can also read his bio, more extensive bio. These days, it's most likely in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or his website as well. So Amit Seru is the Stephen and Roberta Dunning Professor of Finance at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute and Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and a research associate at the NBER. He's also a faculty member he was a faculty member at the University of Chicago Booth School. Professor Seru's primary research interests are in corporate finance. He is interested in issues related to financial intermediation and regulation, intersection of internal organization of firms, and financing and investments. He has published extensively. I can tell you the most important or the most impressive aspect that I know is that his paper, which he's going to be presenting today, I think got 100,000 downloads in 1 week, the first week it was released. That is the most impressive thing I can think about for any paper, okay? Instead of me doing all of this, let me give more time to Amit to talk about the paper. Amit, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sumit and Bernie, for asking me to do this. It's a pleasure. Sorry to interfere in your lunch plans. I was telling Randall Mark that he was sitting while everybody was in the line to get lunch, and it was because he was behaving like an insured depositor. The food was going to be there, so why go ahead in the queue? And seems like he was right. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the things that you might have been aware if you're following the news in the US, and talk about issues that led to the failure of Silicon Valley Bank that you see out there. So failures in US have been clustered. The last episode was in the 07-08 crisis when we had 400-ish banks go under, and the largest of them was Washington Mutual. I'll come back to that a little bit. And you see Silicon Valley Bank in the corner there, and we are going to be talking about that. So my plan is to talk a little bit about, because not everybody does banking, what is banking? So banking 101, very quickly. I'll talk a little bit about Silicon Valley Bank and what did monetary policy have to do with whatever happened there. Then I'm going to broaden the discussion to the study that Sumit was talking about, where we basically look at the whole US banking system and try to figure out how the system looks. I'll introduce the notion of solvency runs, which is going to be critical to understanding how many of the banks might be similar to Silicon Valley Bank or not. This solvency run is different than liquidity runs, which all of us now know very well after the recent Nobel Prize, the Diamond Dybvig, if you didn't already. So I'll talk a little bit about that. That's going to be important to tell us how many banks are at risk. And then I'll talk a little bit about what steps the Fed and the US government has already taken and what risks and implications emerge from that. And hopefully we'll have time to get into more of that also in our Q&A. All right, so here is the starting point. So what is a bank and what does it have to do with what happened to SVB? So this story is going to be in 3 parts. So what's a bank? What is going to be pretty critical if you don't know how banking works is time is going to be an important element, and timing. And if time and timing doesn't sit the way it's supposed to, something is going to blow up, and in this case, it's Silicon Valley Bank. So let me tell you what the story is. Here is what a bank looks like. The numbers are kind of in the rough ballpark of how they looked for Silicon Valley Bank, but it's quite instructive to see how this works. So how does this work? Like any corporation, money comes in. Here is how the money comes in. A chunk in deposits, a little bit in equity, that's called capital. You give the money to the bank, and then what does the bank do? On the asset side, here is how the production looks like. There is some money invested in bonds, treasuries, residential-backed mortgage securities. They make loans to corporates, to retail sector, to household sector, and then they also keep some money in cash. So that's how the bank sort of looks like, a typical bank. And this portion here is the capital, equity capital. I'll come to this several times, so good to remind ourselves. So let's sort of think about how this kind of fits in together in terms of the business model. So on the asset side, let's say when the bank puts all the money to work, they make some amount, so let's say 2%. On the liability side, you're going to pay some amount to your depositors, 1%, let's say. In many cases, it's even below that. There will be a whole discussion, hopefully, about sleepy depositors and what they want and what they don't want. But it's instructive to sort of then see, when you put these things together, that what the equity essentially is getting is this spread, and that's what they keep track of, the shareholders, the managers, this return on equity, right? So here it's 14, 15%, and you see how that's computed. But that's basically the business. So why doesn't everybody do it if it's so straightforward? Seems like a great business model. It turns out that there is a notion of time management that one has to do here. What do I have in mind here? Well, if you look at the liabilities, they are short duration. You might have heard the term maturity transformation. So short duration is basically what the liabilities are. They are, they can flee anytime, potentially. And when you think about assets, they are longer duration. So here is typical durations of assets that, for example, Silicon Valley Bank had. So, your bonds are tied up for 3-4 years. Your loans are for a couple of years. And as a result, your duration on the asset side is very different, very long, relative to your duration on the liability side. So the banks got to manage this. That's the duration mismatch that one talks about in order to earn that return on equity. So if it's about time, you've got to manage it, and timing, therefore, becomes very important. So this is how Silicon Valley Bank looks like. I hope the fonts are big enough, not for those in the back of the room, sorry. But the dotted vertical lines here are end of 2019 to end of 2021. Why am I sort of saying this? Because if you look at the deposits coming into Silicon Valley Bank, this is the time when $140 billion out of that 185 shows up, right? So it's about managing time, but also about timing. So if you're a bank manager or a shareholder, what are you looking at? Well, this is also the time when COVID has kind of hit, and there is contraction in demand. So loans are probably not easily made. So what do? Well, you look at places to park the capital. And here is how the yield curve kind of looks like for treasuries. And if you have a bunch of money and you invest it in short run, well, that doesn't give you much. So what do? Well, it looks pretty safe. I put it somewhere in there because I get some returns at least, and I can keep my business model running as is. Now, one thing which is important here to remember is that when you talk about Silicon Valley Bank, it's 200 billion-ish assets, and there is this limit of systemically important financial institution, which is like 250 billion assets. Above that, you scrutinize these institutions a bit more, though I don't think it's relevant here because of things that I'll come back to, but I just wanted to put this in your mind, that they were below this limit where potentially the scrutiny might be different. So all right, so this is going on, and because of inflation, the Fed decides to raise the interest rates pretty aggressively. What do I mean by aggressively? Well, the yield curve basically looks like this by March of 2023. So in a period of about a year and a quarter, we are talking about a huge change in the interest rates in the economy, okay? If you weren't paying attention, this is another way of looking at the same interest rate change. And on the x-axis here is months after the first hike. And all this is trying to tell you is that 2022 was pretty fast, pretty quick, and a lot in terms of the percent. So, all right, so there is timing, there is time, and there is monetary policy. So what can happen? Well, something is going to blow up because essentially when you look at the duration, if you have long duration assets and your interest rates rises, as we teach pretty much in the first few weeks of a typical MBA class on what is the present value of assets. When interest rates go up, your value of the assets goes down, market value of assets. There is this thing known as duration, so ignoring convexity, where we can compute what will that 3.8% change in the interest rate do. Well, roughly we're talking about a $22 billion loss on the asset side. Concurrently, though, your liabilities are worth less now because you don't need to pay as much because the same kind of logic holds. But because the duration there is just tiny, a short duration, the effect is much smaller. So there is a gain, but not a lot. So in the end, that means that the mark-to-market loss is $21 billion. This is unrealized. This is on the balance sheet. This is the market value. And if you were to calculate the market value of the firm, somehow what that tells you is that, well, this loss is enough to wipe off the equity. Now, this is unrealized, so it all depends on when you have losses. Do I really need to realize them? Traditionally, and we'll get back to this, we've talked about depositors are sleepy because they like dealing with the banks, and if they do, then a bunch of these losses will be absorbed by them because I can just pass on these losses. Another way of saying this is that the depositors are going to just stick around, and yeah, these are mark-to-market losses, but they don't get realized really. You know, I bought these assets at par value. If I stick around for 5-6 years and the depositors stick around, everything is fine and my equity value is not affected. So that's going to be critical. We'll come back to it. But suppose there is a reason why you have to go to the market and sell these securities. That's a problem for you as a bank. And that's kind of what happened in Silicon Valley Bank. Why? Because 90% of Silicon Valley Bank's depositors were uninsured because above $250,000 in the US, you're not insured. And why did they care? Because they are not insured. If you're not insured, you care. So like Randy did not want to go get food because he was insured, but had he known that he was not insured, he might have decided to go in and get first in line like I and Sumit did. So if you do that, and if there is enough of us doing this, every time the bank has to satisfy the depositor showing up, you got to face the market and sell those securities and get those losses. And as a result, if that spooks more depositors, you can see a run might emerge. And this was accentuated because a lot of the depositors in this case were venture capitalists who had portfolio companies. They were talking to each other. So in other words, they were not sleepy. So what happened? Well, we forced the bank to go to the market again and again and again and again and again, and we got a bank run. So $42 billion of deposits were withdrawn on one day. Okay, so that's a huge amount, and no bank can sustain that. So here is another way of looking at this. Money coming in and then money leaving all in one day. So that's what happened in Silicon Valley Bank. Okay, so once that happened over the weekend, so this was 9th, 10th of March, over the weekend, there were different rules that were proposed. The Fed first said SVB wasn't systemic, but then they thought it might be systemic. So we came up with the idea that, okay, the shareholders and some creditors are going to be wiped out. We are going to also insure the uninsured deposits, and we are going to do a bank term funding program where banks can borrow against assets at par value. So yeah, your market value of these assets is down, but the Fed is going to buy these assets at par value in case you need the money to make it work. I'll come back to this because this does solve the problem in the short run, but it leaves us fragile in the long run for something that has happened many times over, but just to plan this is going to be about potential moral hazard. All right, so at this stage, this is still March 10th, and we are still debating whether Silicon Valley Bank is an outlier. And me and my collaborators had been working on something for a long time, which was related to uninsured leverage. And what we were interested in was, if you look at uninsured leverage or uninsured lending to non-bank entities, shadow banks, and you compared their capital structure with banks, it was quite different. So why was it different? How was it different? What were the similarities? Were things that we were interested in. So if you don't know what a shadow bank or a non-bank is, it's exactly does the same thing like a bank, but doesn't take deposits. So once it doesn't take deposits, it's far away from any subsidies or insurance that the FDIC provides them. So their capital structure is all uninsured. And we were interested in trying to understand how do they pick their capital structure and what we can learn from it. So long story short, we were updating this, and over the weekend, we just felt compelled to do this because why not? So we just basically looked at the whole US system and did a mark-to-market test and combined it with something else, which is where my solvency run argument is going to come in. So let me tell you what we did. This is work with my collaborators Erika Jiang, Gregor Matvos, and Tomek Piskorski. So and we did this over the weekend and released it on Monday, which is what Sumit was talking about. So what did we do in this? So we looked at the same kind of map like I showed you with Silicon Valley Bank, and we did it for the whole US system because the data is pretty much available, so it's not very hard to do. So here is a snapshot of the US system. So instead of those numbers, which were Silicon Valley Bank, now think about the whole US system. So $24 trillion of assets, $24 trillion of liabilities. Assets are split into those same kind of categories that you saw before. And what's interesting is on the liability side, there is $9 trillion of insured deposits, $9 trillion of uninsured deposits. So it's not like Silicon Valley Bank had 90% of its deposits that were uninsured, and it was supposed to be an outlier. I'll show you what kind of an outlier it was. But there is a lot of uninsured deposits in the US banking system, 9 trillion, right? The other important thing to notice is equity is about 2 trillion. So that's the aggregate equity in the US banking system. So all right, so what did we then do? We took all the assets and basically said, okay, if you are a long duration asset and all that information is available in call reports and the interest rates changed from the time monetary tightening started till today, which was March 10th, what is the change in the value of the assets, okay? And so what did we get? We got this kind of a snapshot. So mark-to-market losses across the US banking system, about 2 trillion. Okay, and it's split between different types of categories if you're interested. Why is 2 trillion interesting and important, in our mind at least, is remember the total aggregate equity I showed you in the US system was 2 trillion. So suddenly you're thinking, oh wow, this is a big number relative to whatever equity is in the system, because for a long time before that, the Fed and FDIC had kind of said that, hey, we are well capitalized, we don't need to worry, and so on. So I'll again get back to in a short while. If you're interested in the distribution, this is how the distribution looked like. So again, on the x-axis is what the loss was, and on the y-axis is just the density. And the dotted line there is Silicon Valley Bank. So why am I sort of showing you this? Well, on average, we are talking about 10% mark-to-market losses relative to assets. So again, 24 trillion, 10%, 2 trillion-ish. So you get the idea. Silicon Valley Bank is interesting because it's not an outlier. In fact, if unrealized losses were the only thing leading to runs, you would have probably 500 more entities which would be facing runs like Silicon Valley Bank, right? So that was not the whole story. One sort of immediate reaction is that, oh, these are unrealized losses, but many of these might be offset if you do hedging. Right? Like we teach hedging all the time, so what about hedging? And hedging is like this fine wine, if you're interested in wine, about which grapes and which year, and there are some people who kind of like all that. All I'm trying to say is that there's a huge literature on hedging. Had I sort of appreciated that literature more than I should have, given that Some of my colleagues were working on it. I would have not done what we did next, which is we actually went and looked at the data to sort of see, is there any hedging going on or not? And so here are two distributions, and what is being plotted is duration, like I showed you earlier. Duration is not easy to get for many of these banks, but we collected as much as we could. And there are two distributions here. One is the lighter distribution, the orangish, that's before tightening starts, and the darker one is after the tightening starts. What is important here is to just sort of see that, we're talking about an average 4 years, 5 years on the duration side, so very similar to the balance sheet I showed you. In other words, if banks had hedged, this number would be getting close to zero, and it's not. And there is a huge literature on why they should be hedging or not hedging or whatever. But bottom line is there are lots of unrealized losses, and there is accounting literature on this as well, but lots of unrealized losses, but a lot of banks out there potentially, so that's not part of the whole story. And then we looked at this other thing which I told you about, which is uninsured leverage, right? So what is the plot here is the distribution of how much uninsured deposits do you have as a proportion of your assets. And again, here is Silicon Valley Bank. Now you can see it's an outlier because there are only a very few banks which have that much number of uninsured deposits. Having said that, there is a lot of uninsured leverage in the system. So one has to then look at how the losses are interacting with this leverage, which is what we sort of try to do next. Now, uninsured leverage, the way you want to think about uninsured depositors is their incentives to run are pretty high, because if they run, they are first in line and they can get whatever the bank has. If they are sleepy and slow, and FDIC decides to come in. Why FDIC? Because for those who are not from US, FDIC is a regulator whose main primary job is to look at whether insured depositors are going to be full or not. So their incentives are always to look at what is happening with the insured guys. So if you are an uninsured depositor and you're worried that insured deposits might get impaired, you are super worried because FDIC comes in, it closes the bank, and uninsured depositors are actually put behind in the queue. So your incentives to monitor are pretty high, and you've got to worry about it. You might worry that because of some hedging, is there some kind of connection between duration and hedging? Not a lot, okay? So in case you're interested. All right, so the bottom line here is you've got to combine uninsured leverage with unrealized losses to understand the full picture. So one way of thinking about it is there is flight risk because of uninsured leverage, potentially, and there is turbulence on the asset side. Now, if you were to do the same kind of calculation that I did before with mark-to-market losses and fed it through the balance sheet, with the caveat that that may not be what's happening in every bank, but suppose you did that exercise, what would the US banking system look like? Here is how the US banking system would look like. So on the y-axis is mark-to-market losses, and on the x-axis is runnable uninsured deposits over mark-to-market assets for insolvent banks. Okay? So what I'm plotting here is that assume that all the losses are fed in directly to the equity side. Which of the banks in the system are insolvent? They're all here. The size of the bubble tells you the size of the assets. So if it's very big, that's like $1 trillion bank. If it's small, you can see Silicon Valley Bank, that's 200 billion-ish. But the bottom line here is there's a lot of banks potentially that could be at the risk of insolvency. But why do I say potentially? Let me get to that in a bit. So this is the whole snapshot. If you're interested, how did it look before the tightening? Here is that same picture, but this is now plotting maybe something more direct, which is equity over assets. And again, two distributions here, one before, one after the tightening, and the dotted lines are, again, Silicon Valley Bank. And what is it telling you before tightening? This is what everybody was hearing, that, look, there is enough capital in the system, so if you look at equity or assets, kind of looks fine. Average is where it is. And after the tightening, it shifts to the left, not surprisingly, because there are losses in the system. So if you were to look at all the banks below zero, those are all potentially insolvent. Why potentially again and again and again? Because, again, it all depends on how do we think these losses are going to be feeding on the liability side. And that depends on the behavior of depositors. If depositors are going to be sleepy and you're going to be able to pass these losses to them, or they're going to stick around, another way of saying stick around till the end of the duration of the assets, it's all good, no problem. That's basically the franchise value. But if we think the franchise value is shaky for some banks, then you are going to see losses potentially. So what we then next do in the paper is to sort of formalize this idea that you have losses, you have uninsured leverage, and we want to think about runs. So what we sort of talk about is this whole idea of a solvency run. What's the idea of a solvency run? The idea of a solvency run is that, look, there is multiple equilibria possible. You're going to see losses on your assets, but that's not always going to lead to a run. You could be in a good equilibrium, quote unquote, where depositors are sleepy and all the losses are unrealized, and we can just stick around till the end of the period when the assets are due, and no problem, okay? That's not going to lead to a run. But there is a bad equilibrium possible, especially when the interest rates increase sufficiently, because that will depress the value of the assets. There might be other channels too, we'll get into that. But if the interest rates rises sufficiently, a solvency run is possible where a bad equilibrium occurs. What is a bad equilibrium? Well, depending on the beliefs of uninsured depositors on other uninsured depositors running, you could lead to a spiral exactly like Silicon Valley Bank. And what is that, without boring you with the sort of algebra? What are you going to find is that, well, the banks that are at the highest risk of such a solvency run are going to be those which have lower initial capital. So that's my segue in back to the equity that I showed you before. Why? Because if you have more buffer, you can take more losses before it sort of feeds into the depositors. If there is a higher uninsured leverage, why? Because uninsured leverage is what basically leads to more runs, as in they have incentives to run. And if you have more awake uninsured depositors, so if you among uninsured depositors had some sleepy and non-sleepy, again, you can see that that might be something that's important. Why is this important? Because based on this now, you can go back to that picture that I showed you where I told you about potentially insolvent banks. And now we can start looking at different kinds of equilibrium that might emerge. So here is what we then do. Where are these solvency runs possible is what then the exercise is. It's not just mark to market, but we are interested in taking uninsured leverage, doing the equilibrium calculation for different kinds of scenarios. So on the left and the right-hand side picture, both the x-axis have percent of uninsured depositors withdrawing, because that's what leads to the spookiness and the beliefs of other uninsured depositors running. And on the left picture is number of insolvent banks for different scenarios. And on the right is aggregate assets of insolvent banks. So in the paper, we talk about if half the uninsured depositors ran, you would get 190 banks worth $300 billion of assets. So you see that number. And of course, it's nonlinear and depends on how many uninsured depositors are running. All right, so I sort of gave you the picture on how we saw a lot of what was going on 13th. If you look at this banking system in the US, there is a lot of regulation. So you could ask the question, what about regulators? So regulators, of course, have chimed in and changed the tune several times, but the most recent one is it's all about liquidity, right? So there is a Fed report that comes out and on SVB and then on First Republic and so on. I mean, initially it was supposed to be an outlier, no other bank and so on, but I'll sort of talk about why that is potentially problematic. So the Fed report comes out, the liquidity term in the report is mentioned 320 times and solvency is mentioned once. I think that was probably a typo. At the same time, like if you look at what has happened, there is a lot of liquidity being provided. But banks have kept failing. I also want to notice here that if you look at the assets of the banks here, these assets are pretty liquid, right? So you're talking about treasuries, you're talking about tradable RMBS. This is not the typical lender of last resort kind of arguments that we make where these assets are opaque and not traded and we don't know the value and maybe the central bank does and we sort of try to intervene. This is a very different scenario. We're talking about very liquid assets, but we are saying there is a liquidity problem potentially. And then, of course, there is also something about bad management and so on. I actually think that a part of this reason on why regulators despite a very complex, intricate system, didn't kind of do stuff had to do with political economy. So a long time ago, Sumit and co-authors wrote this amazing paper called Inconsistent Regulators. What is the idea there? That if you look at the bunch of banks in the US system, they are regulated not just by states, but also by Fed in rotation. And what does that do? Well, on the one hand, probably increases resiliency, brings more information on the table, but it also exposes the system to political economy considerations. In particular, local regulators are likely to be softer on banks which are pretty big for the local economy, right? So Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic is pretty big for California regulator. They are going to be easy on them. So here is a picture. In the gray is when the federal regulator is regulating the same bank. In the white is when the state regulator is regulating the same bank, and they do it in rotation. So that's the dual regulatory structure in the US. So Silicon Valley Bank would be going through these different regulators in rotation. And what do you see? There is this thing called Camel's rating. Everything that a bank does is based on this rating. And a higher number of this rating is basically telling you the bank is not doing very well. A lower number is, oh, you're amazing. And all I want to sort of point out here is when you look at the white and gray, white always tries to bring the camel rating to saying that you're amazing, and the gray, when the federal regulator comes in, is telling you, hey, you need to do a bunch of stuff. So if you see the rhetoric coming out, it's a very similar kind of story, but yet we haven't seen regulators talk about it. I wonder why. Maybe because they are the ones who are writing that report, but we can leave that for later. All right, so what about implications and beyond SVB? So here is the picture that I showed you before, but expanded. This was, New York Times did this. So if you look at the failures in the prior crisis, we've already these 3 failures are not trivial in terms of dollars already. Is this all focused in California, or is this across the country? I think I've tried to convince you that there is a potential risk in many parts of the country. Here is another way of looking at that same picture that I showed you before. This is the US map, and the darker portion, let's not worry about the numbers here. The darker portion is just telling you places in the country where deposits are at risk, potentially. So a lot of mark-to-market losses, and they are banks where uninsured leverage is high as well. Okay, that's the way to think about it. Now, if it is true that there is franchise value because of which things are going to be fine, one simple way of looking at that is market value of equity. Because like I told you, in the good equilibrium, when a solvency run doesn't happen, you have losses, they get passed on to the depositor, your equity value is fine. It's only in a solvency run that equity gets wiped out. So if you look at what happened to the equity value of a bunch of other banks after Silicon Valley Bank, you can see that their equity value has gone down. So that again tells you potentially we are looking at solvency problems for a non-trivial number of banks. So now what? I already told you a bunch of things have happened, and that this can lead to potential moral hazard. Why do I say this? Because if it is the case that a bunch of banks are insolvent, as in their equity is underwater, we know, we teach this all the time, that this can lead to problems. What kind of problems? Well, we worry about the S&L crisis of 1980s. If you don't remember, this is a picture from that. And we worry about this whole gambling for resurrection. The scenario was very similar. In this picture, there are 2 kinds of losses that happened during the saving and loans crisis. The lower part, which is not the yellow part, is when the interest rates rose and the value of the assets fell. That happened, commercial real estate, long-term loans, and so on. But what people worry about is that yellow portion. What is that? Well, a bunch of insolvent institutions gambled for resurrection. They took risks. What happened? Well, if I win, great for me as an equity holder. If I lose, I was getting 0 anyway. And if you have a lot of banks in the system which are in that situation, you worry about that. So what should we do in the short run? A group of my collaborators and Arvind Krishnamurthy and Peter DiMarzo at Stanford, we wrote a proposal to resolve the crisis potentially. And the summary here is that we are asking for a market test. So what's the idea? That yes, you do get support in the short run and even in the medium run from the government and taxpayers, But if you're insolvent, we want to have a separation of insolvent from solvent banks. Because for insolvent banks, gambling for resurrection is real, and you want to get rid of those or consolidate those banks as quickly as you can. So what is our idea? We are hoping that you want banks to go out and raise equity or raise some capital. That's the market test. Why? Because if you have franchise value, it should show up somewhere. Okay, not tomorrow, but maybe in 90 days, maybe in 180 days, whatever have you. So a market test is what we are hoping for, and we calculate this number to not be very high, even for banks which are at risk. We are talking about 190 billion to 400 billion of additional capital coming in the system, which will already move us away from the zone of insolvency for a bunch of banks. So that's basically what we think in the short run is something that you should think about. And what about long run? I think for a long time, we have relied on regulators to solve all the problems and also tinkering around with regulations and liquidity requirements and so on and so forth. And I think we try to treat this banking system too much like a physics or a chemistry experiment in a laboratory, and we got to be a step back and say, maybe regulators can't solve everything. So if that's the case, how do we solve this problem to not have this again and again and again? And if you look at, for example, what the Fed or even FDIC was saying, well, we need careful regulations to address unprecedented and unanticipated risks. I just want to point out that the Fed also raised the interest rates, right? So it's unclear when the risk we are talking about is simple interest rate risk, which we teach early on to even our MBAs, that regulators are the answer to everything. So I actually think it's time to step away from just asking the regulators to solve all the problems and move basically away from subsidized deposits. Why do I say this? Now I'll close the loop. With my collaborators, we were interested in looking at the uninsured capital leverage of non-banks because we thought that they were uninsured, there was no government support, but they were providing very similar services like the banks. And the question was, how are they doing it? I mean, if they are so fragile, uninsured leverage leads to fragility, what is going on? And that's where this kind of picture is extremely striking. So what do I have here? I have plotted equity to assets. There are two entities here. This is all banks and non-banks. Non-banks are non-depository institutions in the mortgage space. Mortgage market is about $10 trillion market in the US. And on the x-axis is how much lending they are doing. There are two lines here. One is the orange line, which is capital structure of banks, equity to assets. And then there is the gray line, which is equity to assets of shadow banks or non-banks. And the key thing here is that if you look at shadow banks, their leverage or their equity is much higher than banks. And all their capital comes from uninsured depositors or uninsured debt. So in other words, if we force institutions to rely on market, the answer will be you need to have more equity. Why? Because I already told you, solvency runs go down when you have equity. So this is a market solution that exists out there. But if we intervene and then hope that the regulators will bail us out every time, I think we are going to be seeing this again and again and again. And that's basically all I had to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Amit. So we have some time for Q&A. Let me start out with the easy questions. I mean, you must have heard this question before. You have 186 banks. You say potentially can be in trouble. Are you willing to name a few? I have some money deposited in a couple of those banks in America. I want to know if I need to withdraw my money from them.
No. We did not name them for obvious reasons. Yeah.
Okay, let me try to then ask a different question. So you talk about solvency runs. So can I think of a different type of run, which I want to call at reaching for yield run? They're depositors, when they see monetary policy rates go up, they don't care about there is a solvency or not. They just want to move their money to a different bank or different portfolio where they can earn a higher return. what will happen in that scenario? You don't actually need to worry about deposit insurance because they want to withdraw everything and put it in a different place.
Yeah, so, that's the thing that I was telling you, that when we define a solvency run, we basically just have a very stylized, simple way of thinking about it. There is uninsured depositors, and then there is a proportion of awake depositors, and then they'll have beliefs on who's going to be running, and those are the scenarios. You can imagine that the proportion of awake borrowers change with the state variable, which is interest rates. So if that happens, that will accentuate this even more. So there are some studies coming out where they're looking at Twitter, connections on Twitter or digital banks, and arguing that the pace with which some of these things are happening are probably higher for those kinds of banks. So I can see that there are some folks who want to move around based on interest rates, and that actually changes the proportion of how many uninsured depositors or even insured depositors are awake. That makes it even harder for franchise value to remain the way it's defined generally, right? So the franchise value is the idea that deposits are going to be sleepy, and if your interest rates are so salient and now it's easy to transfer money, that cuts into that franchise value because you can basically withdraw anytime.
This can be exasperated, this whole problem.
It could be exasperated, yeah. And I think that's why the Fed and FDIC are kind of trying to figure this out.
Let me open the floor for questions from the audience. Oh, it can't be that crystal clear what you pointed out. Yes, Randall.
So can you expand beyond the U.S. to talk about the magnitude of this problem in G7, in the developed world, in Asia? How big is it?
Yeah, Asia, I'm sure people are more experts looking at the banking system here, so I won't speculate. I think in Europe, my understanding is A, the interest rates didn't go up as dramatically, and B, they may not have as long duration and assets on the balance sheet. I'm talking about big banks as in the US. So maybe the problem is not as acute, and I also don't know exactly how the insurance of depositors works in Europe. And Asia, I am happy to defer it to many experts in the room, but thanks.
Bernie.
I'm curious, do you have a sense of the time series behavior of this group of uninsured deposits? I mean, it's a pretty significant proportion, but is it always that large? Is what we face a temporary issue, or it has always been there?
Yeah, so, the data goes back till, data is easily available from 2001. Before that, I think at some point FDIC will now release it because no one cared about this as much. So the proportion of uninsured deposits in the system is pretty large, even when you go back. So I'm talking about at least 40%. Magnitude-wise, of course, it has grown tremendously, especially during the COVID times and the QE that happened. So if you looked at the study that Raghuram Rajan, Viral Acharya, et cetera, have done, they kind of talk about what happened. So there's a dramatic increase. I mean, you saw that even in Silicon Valley Bank, $140 billion coming in within that year and a half, and no place to park, really. But uninsured depositors have been large for some time. What's important to remember is interest rates haven't been as high for some time, right? So the state variable here is the interest rates. If the interest rates are not high, it doesn't matter, right? So if the interest rates are zero, who cares whether you're uninsured or insured for this kind of run? Interest rates did go up a little bit in 05, 06, and at that time also we had some runs. Now they were much slower, and also there were credit problems. Right, so as you might remember, there were housing problems, loan problems. So there was other reasons to be insolvent well before any mark-to-market stuff. And a bank like here, Washington Mutual, which is one of the largest failures that had occurred before what we are seeing right now, there was a bunch of uninsured depositors running for weeks. So the difference right now, connecting to what you said, is if you're insolvent for various reasons, mark to market because of interest rate increase or credit losses, you probably would see a run happening in 10 days, 20 days, versus a one-day event that happened here. But if you're insolvent, you're insolvent. And trying to save an insolvent bank doesn't necessarily end up in a good place. I mean, you can see that from First Republic, for example. Right? First Republic, we tried to save it for many, many days, but in the end, it was an insolvent bank.
Shasha?
Clarification, should regulators also worry about the sleepiness of your depositors? So conditional on being uninsured, if you are part of the same information cluster like a WhatsApp group or Twitter, the likelihood of run is going to be higher. And how do regulators account for that? Thank you.
Yeah, so, there is some discussions happening to do all that, right? So let's try to track who's connected, who's not connected. Let's make people not talk to each other. Let's introduce some sludge in the system. There's a lot of proposals being floated out there. Now, the essence of all those proposals is that this amazing structure called banks that we have, where short-term deposits are needed, and the maturity transformation occurs inside a bank with long-term assets that are created, is special. If we want to preserve this structure, all of those things kind of make sense. But if we don't think that's necessarily the only structure that can do that investment in long-term assets, and we can provide liquidity or whatever other things at the short end to the households separately, it's unclear you want to go in that direction. Because if you now are going to ask regulators to do all the things they're doing and also track who is connected, who is not connected, how many are connected, this is the exact thing that I was trying to say in the end, that you can't expect them to solve this problem. What's the issue that we are trying to solve? One thing I'll mention here, which I didn't have too much of a chance to talk about, is there is a whole accounting discussion that is behind a bunch of this stuff. Banks put a bunch of their assets for sale, and banks put a bunch of their assets in hold to maturity categories. Why does it matter? Because if it's in hold to maturity category, even if there are losses, you don't have to feed it into your earnings and your balance sheet and income statement immediately. Why have we allowed this? Well, because we think that if banks are actually adding value in the long run, we want to give them that leeway. Because if you just mark to market them, that's not allowing for the maturity transformation that we are hoping that they will do. Problem with that argument, I mean, there is a huge merit to that argument. The problem with that argument, that's what connects to your question, is it's invariant to, is the bank solvent? It's invariant to, are they uninsured? Is the entire capital structure uninsured? Because you could be putting a bunch of stuff in hold to maturity, but if you are funded by fly-by-night depositors, this is not a very stable system. Similarly, if you are going to be doing this in an insolvent bank, not a great thing. So I think this hold to maturity accounting rules are likely to change, where they're going to combine it with the kind of things that you might want to be thinking about, which is uninsured leverage, how runnable are your deposits, and so on. Yeah.
Roger, and then Sheridan.
Hi, suppose the uninsured depositors run and they stay within the banking system, and we can predict which banks they would go to. Can we just get those bigger banks to just take over these runnable or high risk of run banks that will solve the problem ahead of time?
Yeah, so if you look at least in some instances, we have some information on where the uninsured deposits went. Some of it went outside the system. I think the latest estimate that I saw was 2 trillion left. So out of the 9 trillion that I showed you, probably only 7 trillion is in the banking system now, so 2 trillion is outside. You can imagine different kinds of investments, luckily, crypto was not doing amazing. Otherwise, I would imagine crypto would be getting some. It's not all going in the too big to fail banks. So in the US, for those who don't know, there are a few banks which are considered too big to fail, but a large chunk is. And I think one view of this whole situation is that we have about 4,800 banks in the US system, 4,800. It used to be 15,000. So maybe we have too many banks. And if all the banks are doing is get some deposit subsidy and then invest in treasuries and RMBS, we don't necessarily need this institution. And maybe we should consolidate that into a few entities. There is a huge political economy, as you can imagine, because a bunch of these banks are local banks. Local banks are important for local economies. So anything that happens in outside the US, when you have local banks controlled by government directly or indirectly, the same thing kind of happens in the US, but at the state versus federal level. So I don't see us consolidating it, though it's a pretty sensible, reasonable solution. If you look at Canada, we have only a few banks, and then they have incentives to behave, and everybody has incentives to make sure they behave. 4,800 is a bit too many, and I think that's what we are seeing there.
Sure. Excuse me. A lot of the discussion is sort of resting on the assumption that the maturity transformation role of banks somehow makes the banks inherently exposed to interest rate risk, which I don't understand. Why aren't the regulators simply requiring the banks to hedge out all their interest rate risk and not be exposed?
Yeah, so I think that's why I said that, like, had I followed the work by my colleagues, I would have not done all my calculations and collected data. I think the short answer is regulators have the same view that liability is actually, there is a franchise value if the depositors are sleepy. And, so for those who don't understand banking or haven't paid attention to franchise value, think about intangible assets, like a brand value in any corporation. So that's what we're talking about. The difference is the franchise value goes up with interest rates. Why? Because franchise value comes from depositors being sleepy, so you charge them, you give them 0 or a very low deposit rate, and the value of this becomes higher and higher as the market rates are higher. Why? Because you can get funding at a very low rate because you can offer them to the depositors, but the market rates are pretty high. So the franchise value goes up with interest rates. So the belief has been, which I agree with you, Sheridan, I'm in your camp, that franchise value is going to offset any mark-to-market losses that might occur on the asset side. So if you take that view seriously, then you are naturally hedged, and you don't need to worry about hedging. So
Okay.
that was the view.
So they're taking a very extreme assumption
Yeah.
about franchise value.
Yeah, which is why the whole discussion about depositors being sleepy, not sleepy, connected, digital, are all relevant constructs.
Okay, thank you.
Or we could look at corporations where uninsured debt was already there, which was runnable, and learn a thing or two from them because they actually have a lot of equity.
I guess there would be evidence of that because a lot of these banks that were very exposed to interest rate changes, which you found did not have runs and did survive.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's strong evidence of franchise value.
Totally. But at the same time, if you look at tradable banks, which is about 250-ish banks are traded in the market, and you look at their equity value, that's the only place where we see market value of equity is down. So I think the evidence is still to be determined.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. So you haven't mentioned much during the talk, but if the issue is about uninsured depositor, so what do you think about the deposit insurance? Should the FDIC just fully cover every depositor without any threshold? So what do you think about that?
So I think one issue is right now, what are we going to do? So, when we have given deposit insurance to deposits above $250,000, which is effectively what has kind of happened. This is the reason why uninsured depositors are kind of calm. we have the whole issue of future moral hazard, because you have a bunch of insolvent institutions where you have a bunch of deposits, they are all insured, so you can offer them whatever you want to get them in the door because they are insured. And with that money, you're insolvent, you have huge incentives to go long on very risky ventures, right? So that's the short-term worry that I have, even though de facto we have done it, okay? So how we undo it, I don't know yet, we'll see. In the long run, I think the question is, I think we were having this conversation at lunch. The issue is, why did we have deposit insurance to begin with? The idea was banks are special and they're fragile. Why are they fragile? Short-term asset transformation into long run. And they are the only institutions who can do it. So if we still believe that, I could see arguments for doing deposit insurance en masse. But there are also these entities now called private equity, right, which was well after Diamond Dibwig. But if you look at private equity, what is private equity? Well, they take money from endowments, pension funds, and so on a long-term basis, and then they invest in a long-term basis in illiquid assets and so on. They are not, there is no deposit insurance. They are long-term contracts, and they are investing in long run. So we could go to that structure. But if we think banks are special, and they only can do that kind of thing, then deposit insurance at a larger scale is probably needed, or some other kind of intervention. I don't know if I'm fully convinced we need to go there. I think we need to try these different structures, which clearly have emerged from the market, like private equity, and where the funding model is quite different. Long-term loans, long-term debt getting invested in long-term assets seems to be working okay. So we should give that a try.
So let me just follow up on Randy's point, which we're suggesting, what about other countries? Why don't you guys set up a website based on your paper that allows researchers from other countries to input their data, call report data, and know which bank is solvent and not solvent based on your methodology? I think that will solve, and everybody around the world can know, is my bank solvent or not solvent?
All right, I'll make sure I start working on it right away.
Thank you very much, everybody, for being there, and thank you to Amit for a great talk.